Megan thought no one was watching, but Daniel saw everything, and what he saw inside that parked car shattered his world in an instant. Ethan Walker woke up every morning at 6 o'clock a.m., made himself a cup of black coffee, and read the newspaper before heading to work at his real estate office in downtown Denver. For the past 9 years, he followed this routine like clockwork. He took pride in structure and order, in the idea that life could be managed if you just stuck to the rules. He had married Melissa 8 years ago, thinking she shared the same values. At first, everything seemed to align. They moved into a modest but stylish 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood filled with trimmed hedges, barking dogs, and neighbors who smiled too much. Their life was clean, comfortable, and unremarkable. But over the past few months, Ethan noticed something shifting. Melissa's routine no longer matched his. Her yoga classes, which used to be twice a week, suddenly became daily. Sometimes she didn't come home until midnight. She blamed new clients and late sessions. Ethan wanted to believe her, but the little signs kept growing. Her phone, once left on kitchen counters and coffee tables without thought, was now glued to her hand or hidden in her purse. She giggled at messages she never shared, left rooms to take calls, and changed her passcode 3 times in 1 month. At first, Ethan tried to explain it away. He convinced himself she was just stressed, perhaps overwhelmed by responsibilities. But even their interactions changed. Her eyes no longer lit up when he walked into the room. Her touch became cold, mechanical, as though affection was just a task to be completed. There was no fighting, no shouting, just silence, distance, and the kind of emptiness that could only come from betrayal hiding beneath the surface. One evening, Ethan stopped by the grocery store on his way home. On a whim, he decided to take a longer route back through Riverside Park. He hadn't been there in years, not since he and Melissa used to go on picnics in their early dating days. As he passed the far end of the parking lot, his eyes caught a familiar vehicle, a silver SUV. His stomach dropped. It was Melissa's. It was parked at the edge of the lot, partially hidden behind a row of trees. The windows were fogged and the engine was running. Ethan slowed his car and coasted to a stop without turning on his headlights. The night was still. He sat in silence for a moment, debating whether to get out. Then he saw movement. Inside the SUV, shapes shifted. He leaned forward and squinted, his knuckles whitening around the steering wheel. A man's hand reached out to touch Melissa's face. Ethan's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. He saw Melissa's hair, her profile, and her bare shoulders. The man leaned in. Their faces met. There was no mistaking what was happening. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter, every muscle in his body frozen. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. Instead, he stared. Then, as quietly as he had come, he reversed his car, turned around, and drove away into the darkness. He couldn't think. He couldn't process what he'd just seen. It was surreal, like watching someone else's nightmare unfold through a screen. When he got home, he sat in the living room without turning on the lights. The house was still, except for the ticking of the clock above the fireplace. Midnight came, then 1. Melissa didn't return until 1:30 a.m. She tiptoed inside, careful not to wake him. She didn't know he had been sitting in the dark for hours, watching her shadow move through the house like a stranger. Ethan didn't confront her. He didn't want a lie. He didn't want an apology. He wanted the truth, and he knew she wouldn't give it to him freely. So he waited. The next morning, he left for work early but didn't go to the office. Instead, he sat in his car outside a private investigator's office for half an hour before finally walking in and hiring someone to follow his wife. The investigator, a quiet man named Greg with a wrinkled suit and tired eyes, listened carefully and asked few questions. Ethan handed over Melissa's photo, her schedule, her license plate number. He didn't want the investigator to stop until every detail was uncovered. He needed proof not just for himself, but to make sure he wasn't losing his mind. Days passed, then a week. Greg called and asked Ethan to come in. The moment Ethan stepped into the office, he saw the photos spread across the desk. Melissa and a man, young, athletic, tattooed, walking into a motel, holding hands at a gas station, kissing behind her yoga studio. The man wasn't someone Ethan had ever seen. He didn't look like a friend or even a casual acquaintance. He looked like a secret, raw and deliberate. Greg gave him everything: timestamps, locations, phone records, even a receipt Melissa left in her car for a hotel room charged to a fake name. It was overwhelming. Ethan took the file home, locked himself in the guest room, and studied every page like he was preparing for a trial. Because, in a way, he was. His marriage was on trial, and the verdict was already clear. Melissa still smiled at him in the mornings. She still made coffee and asked about his day. It was like watching a performance from someone who had forgotten their audience knew the ending. Ethan responded with polite nods, careful not to let her see the anger building inside. He didn't know what he would do yet, but something inside him had broken. And once broken, it didn't come back the same. Each night Ethan stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence of their shared bed, and remembered the sight of her in that car, her hands gripping a stranger's face like he was the one she had vowed her life to. That image stayed with him like a burn that wouldn't fade. He didn't tell his family. He didn't tell his friends. He wore the mask of a faithful husband while his world crumbled in slow motion. The worst part wasn't the cheating. It was the knowledge that Melissa chose someone else over and over again and pretended like everything was fine. That kind of deception couldn't be forgiven. It couldn't be undone. And in the back of his mind, a new thought began to grow. If she could lie so easily, if she could betray him so completely, what else was she capable of? What else had she hidden? What if the betrayal he saw was only the surface? Ethan wasn't sure yet, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to be the fool in this story. He had seen the truth. Now he had to decide what to do with it. The man in the photos was identified as Jordan Reyes, a 24-year-old mechanic who worked at a small auto repair shop near the edge of town. He had a reputation for being charming, a bit reckless, and always surrounded by drama. Greg, the private investigator, dug into Jordan's background thoroughly. No criminal record, but plenty of history, multiple short-lived relationships, 2 restraining orders filed by former girlfriends, and rumors of involvement with married women. He lived with his mother in a modest single-story house that hadn't been painted in years. He worked 6 days a week and spent most of his evenings hanging out at bars or lounging in his garage fixing up old cars. Ethan looked at Jordan's photos for hours, memorizing the way he moved, the way he dressed, the careless grin on his face as he leaned toward Melissa. That expression haunted Ethan. It was the grin of someone who knew he was stealing something and didn't care. Someone who believed there would never be consequences. Melissa had met Jordan 3 months earlier when her car began making a strange noise. She brought it into the shop one afternoon while Ethan was out of town at a real estate seminar. Jordan had offered to fix it on the spot. They talked while he worked. She laughed at his jokes. He offered her a drink from a vending machine. She accepted. And that's how it started. A simple repair turned into something much more. Within days, they were messaging each other. Late-night texts led to phone calls. Then came lunch dates. Then hotel rooms. And finally, parked cars in dark corners of public parks. Melissa had never mentioned him once to Ethan, not even in passing, not even as a casual story about her day. That silence said everything. Greg's investigation revealed a detailed timeline. Melissa and Jordan had met at least a dozen times in person over the past 2 months. Most of the meetings happened on days when Ethan was at work or attending property showings. The yoga class excuses were just that, excuses. She had even skipped actual classes, leaving clients waiting or rescheduling sessions last minute, all to be with Jordan. Ethan saw the pattern forming. The affair wasn't a single mistake, it was a lifestyle shift. Melissa had begun crafting her entire schedule around this secret life. She was juggling 2 identities, the wife who kept the house clean and smiled at neighbors, and the woman who disappeared into cheap motels with a younger man during the day. What bothered Ethan most wasn't the physical betrayal. It was the time, the planning, the effort. She had to lie every single day. She had to look him in the eyes every morning and pretend nothing was happening. She had to come home and act like she cared, while her heart had clearly been left in the passenger seat of someone else's car. The betrayal twisted something inside Ethan. He became obsessed with understanding everything. He studied every detail. What did she wear to the meetings? How long did she stay? How often did they talk? It was no longer just about the affair. It was about knowing who Melissa had become, someone he clearly no longer recognized. He started tailing her himself. On one occasion, she said she had a class that ran late. Ethan followed her instead. She didn't go to the yoga studio. She went to a fast food place on the edge of town, parked her SUV in the corner of the lot, and waited. 15 minutes later, Jordan pulled up in his rusted black car. She got out, walked to his car, and got in. They didn't even pretend to be discreet. Ethan watched them laugh, touch, lean into each other. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, and the pain in his chest grew unbearable. He stayed there until they drove off together. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. He already knew where they were going. Ethan began keeping a journal, something he hadn't done since college. But this wasn't for healing or self-reflection. It was to document everything. He listed dates, times, locations, and observations. He printed the photos and clipped them into the pages. He labeled each entry meticulously, turning his pain into a controlled archive. It was the only way he could keep himself from falling apart. One afternoon, he opened Melissa's laptop while she was in the shower. She had left it unlocked. He went straight to her email. Most of it was junk or spam, but then he found a folder marked MISC. Inside were dozens of unsent drafts, letters, messages to Jordan. She never sent them, but she wrote them. Some were romantic, some were angry, some hinted at confusion and regret, but all of them confirmed that this wasn't just a fling. Ethan read every word. He read how she felt trapped in a life she hadn't wanted, how she wished she had met Jordan earlier, how she felt young again when she was with him, how she wanted to run away, but didn't have the courage. It crushed Ethan. She had rewritten their entire marriage in her head. The love they had built over 8 years had been reduced to a cage she wanted to escape from. Still, he didn't confront her. He needed more, not just for the truth, but for something else he couldn't name yet. He began thinking long-term. What would happen if he exposed everything? Would she admit it? Would she leave? Would she blame him? He didn't want a messy divorce full of finger-pointing and lies. He wanted certainty. He wanted control over the ending. Ethan stopped sleeping well. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the fogged-up SUV window. He saw her laugh. He saw her kiss another man. The memories burned like acid in his veins. He began to withdraw from his friends, making excuses to avoid gatherings. At work, he smiled when necessary, but his focus had shattered. He spent more time staring at his office wall than returning client calls. His world had narrowed to 2 people, Melissa and Jordan. One day, as he stared at his journal, a thought crept in, an unshakable, dangerous thought. He had all the pieces. The photos, the emails, the footage. He knew their schedules, their habits, their secrets. If he wanted to, he could ruin them. He could end it all on his own terms. But he didn't write that thought down. Not yet. Instead, he closed the journal, placed it back in its hiding spot behind the bookshelf, and went downstairs to make dinner. Melissa walked in a few minutes later, smiling like she always did, tossing her gym bag on the counter and complaining about traffic. Ethan smiled back. For now. The dinner that night was quiet. Melissa sat across from Ethan at the table, scrolling through her phone between bites of grilled chicken. She complimented the food absent-mindedly, told him about a client who brought her flowers after class, then disappeared into a rant about the rising price of almond milk. Ethan nodded where necessary, smiled when expected, and played the role of the patient, loyal husband. He had learned to mimic his old self well. Behind every polite response was the weight of what he knew, every lie, every secret, every betrayal neatly cataloged in his mind like files in a cabinet he opened daily. That night, as she slept soundly beside him, Ethan stayed awake, staring at the ceiling fan. He'd been collecting evidence for weeks, gathering a complete picture of Melissa's second life. He had the timeline memorized. She met Jordan on a Tuesday. Their first hotel rendezvous was a Thursday. The first late-night car meeting had happened on a rainy Friday, less than a month after their introduction. She never hesitated, never slowed down, never questioned the consequences. The next morning, Ethan left home under the pretense of showing a property. Instead, he drove across town to a coffee shop near Jordan's garage. He parked where he had a clear view of the lot, pulled down his cap and watched. Jordan emerged from the garage shortly after noon, wiping his hands on a rag, laughing with a coworker. Ethan studied his every movement, the way he strutted, how he tossed his keys, how easily he smiled. This was the man Melissa had chosen. This was the man who had walked into Ethan's life and stolen everything. Jordan got into his car and drove off. Ethan followed from a distance. He watched as Jordan stopped at a diner, ordered takeout, then drove to a public park. There, he met Melissa. She got out of her SUV and joined him in his car. They sat for nearly an hour, eating, talking, touching. Ethan stayed just far enough to avoid notice, his hands gripping the steering wheel as a new kind of anger began to take root. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was humiliation. He was the outsider now, watching the woman he loved play house with someone else in plain sight. When Melissa returned home that night, she was glowing. She kissed Ethan on the cheek, told him she was sore from class, and disappeared into the shower. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her gym bag. Curiosity pulled at him like a magnet. He opened it carefully, rifling through the pockets. A spare pair of leggings, a hair tie, a motel keycard. He slipped it into his pocket without hesitation. The next morning, while Melissa taught a class, Ethan drove to the motel. Room 107. He knocked. No answer. He waited until the cleaning staff walked past, then followed one of them with a casual smile and a polite question about booking. When the hallway cleared, he slipped inside the room using the keycard. The air smelled faintly of perfume and sweat. On the nightstand, an empty water bottle, a wrapper from a fast food meal, a receipt folded beside the bed. He scanned the room, absorbing every detail. The covers were slightly rumpled. There were faint red smudges on the mirror, lipstick, or fingerprints. He didn't touch anything. He just stood there, surrounded by proof of what had taken place over and over again behind his back. Ethan left without a word. He didn't need more photos. He didn't need more messages. He already had enough to bury Melissa in the truth. But a part of him didn't want the legal route. Divorce felt too clean, too predictable. She would cry, blame the affair on stress or confusion, and walk away with a settlement and half of everything they built. No, that wasn't good enough. Ethan began altering his behavior subtly. He became more attentive, more affectionate. He offered to help Melissa with her class scheduling, asked about her day, cooked her favorite meals. She responded with a renewed sense of security, unaware of the growing storm beneath his calm exterior. She believed the danger had passed, that Ethan, once suspicious, was now lulled back into trust. It was exactly what he wanted. He started planting seeds, casual questions, fake vulnerability. He asked Melissa if she ever thought about starting fresh somewhere else. He told her he was burned out from work, thinking about moving out of the city. She smiled and nodded along, adding little details to the fantasy. Maybe California, maybe Florida. She said she'd always wanted to be closer to the beach. Ethan agreed. Next, he visited a lawyer not to file for divorce, but to ask questions. He wanted to understand asset division, hidden income, and custodial rights should there ever be children involved. He left with more than legal advice. He left with a plan. Melissa's behavior didn't change. She continued to meet Jordan, slipping in and out of the house like nothing was wrong. She stopped being cautious. Her lies became lazy, her excuses weaker. Ethan watched, always watching, waiting for the perfect moment. One night, he received a message from Greg, the investigator. A new set of photos. Melissa and Jordan in his car, parked near the same remote park where Ethan first saw them. This time, they weren't just kissing. The windows were clear. Their bodies were visible. Ethan downloaded the footage onto a USB drive and locked it in his desk drawer. He printed copies of the photos and sealed them in a plain manila envelope. He labeled it simply, The Truth. He made 3 identical versions and stored them in separate places, one in his office, one in his car, and one under a loose floorboard in the attic. Ethan knew the end was close. He could feel it in every quiet glance Melissa gave him. She was too comfortable, too confident. She believed he had forgiven her, that he would never leave, that he would never do anything drastic. She didn't know Ethan had already decided how this story would end. He wasn't going to raise his voice. He wasn't going to plead or bargain. He wasn't going to walk away empty-handed. He was going to make sure that when the final act unfolded, Melissa would understand exactly what it felt like to be powerless, to be exposed, to be erased from the life she thought she controlled. And Jordan, he would learn that some men don't fight for what's theirs with fists or words. Some men wait, and when they strike, no one sees it coming. The plan took shape slowly, like a puzzle coming together piece by piece. Ethan had always been deliberate, and now that trait became a weapon. He began crafting the illusion of healing, a convincing performance designed to disarm Melissa completely. Every conversation was calculated, every gesture carefully measured. He pretended to be rebuilding trust, while underneath the surface, he was mapping out her downfall in perfect detail. He invited Melissa out for dinner more often, took her to places they hadn't been in years. They laughed over wine, shared old memories, and she responded to his renewed attention with an affection that seemed genuine. She started leaving her phone unattended again. Her passwords stayed the same. She thought the worst had passed. Ethan even suggested they take a short trip together, just the two of them. Melissa agreed without hesitation, believing this was his way of starting over. She didn't see the traps being laid around her. In reality, the trip was a smokescreen. Ethan had no intention of spending quality time with her. He booked the trip for 2 weeks in the future and used the time in between to finalize the more intricate parts of his scheme. One night, while Melissa was asleep, Ethan snuck into her car and planted a small recording device beneath the driver's seat. He wanted proof: her voice, her words, her confessions. He also needed to know if she was still seeing Jordan behind the scenes, despite all her claims that it had ended. The device worked better than he expected. In just 3 days, it captured Melissa speaking to Jordan over the phone on multiple occasions. She told him she missed him. She said she was only staying with Ethan long enough to avoid suspicion. She promised they'd be together again soon. She mentioned the trip, calling it a formality. Then, something else. She mentioned Ethan's life insurance policy. She said it was larger than she thought. She laughed when she said it. That changed everything. Ethan had suspected she was selfish, dishonest, reckless. But now, he saw a darker layer. She was not just cheating. She was fantasizing about life without him, about what she could gain if he simply vanished. The recordings became his lifeline, a reason to press forward. He backed up every file, sent a copy to Greg, and stored another in a secure cloud folder under an alias. If anything happened to him, someone would know the truth. Then came Jordan. He was the wild card Ethan couldn't control. Reckless and impulsive, Jordan had already started asking Melissa for more time, more promises, more money. Melissa was beginning to panic. The fantasy was unraveling, and she didn't know how to fix it. Ethan noticed the tension in her shoulders, the sudden mood swings. She was nervous now, not because she was guilty, but because her control was slipping. Ethan waited patiently. He didn't confront her. He didn't press her for answers. Instead, he added another step to his plan. He created an anonymous email account and sent Jordan a message. It was simple. "She's lying to both of us. Meet me if you want to hear the truth." He attached a photo one Melissa had taken with Jordan just a week ago, along with a time and location for a private meeting. Jordan showed up. Ethan waited in his car across the street, watching as the mechanic paced near the old gas station he had chosen for the meeting spot. Jordan looked around, confused and tense, checking his phone every few minutes. Ethan never approached him. He just wanted to see how far Jordan would go. After 20 minutes, Jordan left, angry and frustrated. The message had been received. The next few days passed in silence. Melissa seemed more distracted than ever. She spent hours locked in the bedroom pretending to be asleep or on her laptop pretending to work. Ethan kept track of her movements, monitored her texts when she wasn't looking, and reviewed every new voice recording from her car. The tone in her voice had changed. Less laughter, more anxiety. Her lies were wearing thin. That weekend, Ethan told her he wanted to take the trip early. He claimed he needed a break from work sooner than expected. Melissa agreed quickly, eager to leave town and escape whatever pressure had been building around her. She packed light and asked if they could take her SUV instead of his car. Ethan agreed without hesitation. That was exactly what he wanted. They left early on a Saturday morning, heading toward a remote cabin he had rented weeks ago. Melissa believed it was a spontaneous getaway, but Ethan had already stocked the cabin with food, supplies, and everything else he needed. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, no distractions. The drive was quiet. Melissa stared out the window for most of the ride, chewing on her lip and scrolling through old texts. Ethan played soft music and asked her about the studio, pretending to be relaxed. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. Melissa stepped inside the cabin and complimented the place. She said it was cute, that it reminded her of the old days. Ethan smiled and carried their bags inside. He cooked dinner while she took a shower. Then they sat by the fire, drinking wine and staring at the flames. For a moment, it felt real, like things had truly returned to normal. But Ethan knew better. After she fell asleep, he stepped outside and stood on the porch. The night air was cold and still. He looked up at the stars, wondering what Melissa was dreaming about, wondering if she knew just how close everything was to coming undone. The next morning, Ethan woke early and went for a walk into the woods behind the cabin. He followed the narrow path for half a mile until he reached the place he had chosen a week earlier, a flat clearing hidden by trees and surrounded by silence. He took out the shovel he had hidden nearby and began digging. He worked in complete silence, one shovel of dirt at a time. He didn't think about what came next. He didn't need to. When he finished, he stood over the hole and stared down into the darkness. Then he walked back to the cabin. Melissa was still asleep when he returned. He sat at the table and stared at her, not with love, not with hate, but with clarity. He knew what she had done. He knew what she was capable of. Now, he just had to decide what he was going to do about it. Melissa woke up late that morning. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden beams settling in the cool mountain air. She stretched, walked into the small kitchen, and found Ethan already dressed and sipping coffee by the window. He smiled at her, the same soft, easy smile that had made her trust him years ago. She returned it with a sleepy grin and asked if he slept well. He nodded and poured her a cup of coffee. They sat in silence, sipping, pretending. The hours passed slowly. Melissa spent the afternoon reading a book by the fireplace while Ethan wandered around the property, appearing relaxed, but watching everything. Every move she made, every glance she gave him. At one point, she asked if he wanted to go on a short hike. He agreed and led her into the woods, down the narrow path he had taken earlier. She walked behind him, humming softly, unaware that she was following his footsteps toward the place he had prepared. When they reached the clearing, Ethan paused. Melissa looked around, confused. She asked what they were doing out here. He told her he just wanted to show her the view. She stepped forward and stood at the edge of the shallow hole he had dug. She didn't recognize it for what it was. She thought it was natural, maybe an old fire pit or a place for camping. She turned to him and smiled. He didn't respond. He just stared at her, his eyes empty of emotion. Melissa sensed something shift then, something subtle but unmistakable. Her smile faded. She asked if he was okay. Ethan stepped closer. She took a step back, glancing around, now truly noticing that they were alone. No cars, no phones, no noise but the wind in the trees. Ethan's expression didn't change. He told her everything. He told her he had known from the start, about the affair, about the meetings, about Jordan. He told her he had photos, recordings, texts, emails. He described the motel room, the conversations captured in her car, the moment he saw her with Jordan in the park, the motel keycard, the whispers about his life insurance, all of it. And he said it not with anger, but with a calm, chilling clarity. Melissa was frozen, her face drained of color. She tried to explain, to reach for excuses, but Ethan cut her off with a single raised hand. He didn't want apologies. He didn't want tears. He only wanted the truth. She gave it, slowly, carefully, piece by piece. She admitted to the affair. She admitted to telling Jordan things she didn't mean. She said she never planned to hurt Ethan, that she just got lost, that she missed being wanted, that she thought the marriage had become too predictable, too ordinary. She swore she never wanted Ethan dead, that she was just venting in those messages, just talking. But Ethan didn't believe her anymore, not because of what she said, but because of what she had already done. Words could be twisted, reshaped, but the actions, the choices she made again and again, they were irreversible. He asked her one last question. If Jordan hadn't gone missing, would she have left? She didn't answer right away. Her hesitation said more than any words ever could. That was enough. They walked back to the cabin in silence. Melissa stayed close to him, watching him carefully, unsure of what he would do next. She tried to act normal, tried to smile again, to rebuild what she had shattered. But something had changed in Ethan. He no longer looked at her as a partner or a victim or even a stranger. He looked at her like she was a memory. That night, she fell asleep before him, exhausted from the emotional collapse in the woods. Ethan lay beside her for a long time, watching her breathe. Then he got up quietly, left the room, and walked outside. The stars above were cold and bright. The woods behind the cabin were silent again. The next morning, the cabin was empty. Melissa was gone. Her SUV was still parked outside. Her phone sat on the kitchen table, her bag untouched. At first glance, it looked like she had gone for a walk, but she never returned. Hours passed, then days. Ethan called the police, reported her missing. He sounded concerned, worried, told them she went for a hike and never came back. He helped them search, gave interviews, hung up flyers. Volunteers combed the forest. No one found anything. The story made local news. Wife vanishes during weekend getaway. People were shocked. The perfect couple, a quiet mountain escape. Then suddenly, she was gone. Ethan was praised for his strength, for his composure. He cried in front of the cameras. He thanked the police. He asked for prayers. The investigation continued for weeks, but there was no sign of Melissa. No body, no struggle, just silence. And Jordan? He had already disappeared 2 weeks earlier. His mother filed a report. His co-workers said he stopped showing up. His phone disconnected. At first, the two disappearances seemed unrelated. But then detectives noticed Melissa and Jordan had been involved. The connection triggered a deeper look. That's when they found something chilling. Surveillance footage from a local parking lot showed Jordan getting into Melissa's SUV. That was the last time he was seen. Then came the financial records, a burner phone, cash withdrawals, and a trail that stopped cold the day Melissa vanished. Investigators returned to the cabin. They questioned Ethan again. He was calm, cooperative, but as they looked deeper, inconsistencies began to surface. Small things, gaps in his story, details that didn't line up. Then came the breakthrough. A hidden flash drive was discovered in a safety deposit box under an alias tied to Ethan. On it were recordings Melissa's voice, her conversations, the insurance mention, the affair, all of it. It raised more questions than it answered. Why would Ethan save these? Why hide them? Why wait? But without bodies, without direct evidence, there was nothing to charge him with. Both Melissa and Jordan remained missing. No conclusive trace. No confirmed foul play. Ethan returned home eventually, sold the house, quit his job, disappeared from the city quietly. Some said he moved out of state. Others believed he changed his name and started over. But those who knew the story never forgot. 2 people vanished. 1 man walked away, and in the shadows of that cabin in the woods, beneath the quiet ground, the answers still sleep, waiting,